There's suffering inherent in all life. As the Buddha said, old age is suffering, sickness is suffering, birth is suffering, death is suffering, getting what you want is suffering because it's in time and it's going to go away. Not getting what you want is suffering. Getting what you don't want is suffering. He said that from the highest realms of reality down to the lowest, all are places wherein repeated birth and death take place. So our issue here is that most of the time we want to push away our suffering and cling to our joys at the we want to cling to our joys rather than our sufferings, and we hope that suffering can be eliminated and they can go away. But suffering is inherent, and every person carries with them their own personal suffering to whatever extent that might be, whether it is the loss of loved ones or their crippling depression or their anxiety and fear. And if you're not suffering right now, just wait. You have been and you will be. So there's never a time and form where there's no suffering. And we suffer because of our clingings of mind and our attachments. So the Buddha said that there's nothing so beneficial as a controlled mind, as a mind that has been mastered. There's nothing that is so beneficial to enlightenment than a healthy and controlled mind. And he said he can't think of one other thing more detrimental to peace and happiness than an uncontrolled mind. And what that means is that most of us, we suffer because of our mind, right? And we try and pull our awareness away from it as we work on spiritual practices so that we suffer because of our attachments to our mind. So it's not about, the mind does come under control and you can master it through practices, and the ultimate mastering of the mind is when it dissolves and there's the realization of no mind. But you also want to pull away that attachment and clinging to the various thoughts, because as long as you're trapped in the dualities, there's suffering, because there's joy and there's sorrow, there's highs and there's lows, there's pleasure and pain. Repeated birth and death take place. So by running away from suffering for momentary pleasures and pains, you never find it. You're never going to find it. You might be happy for a little bit, but it's going to go away and it's going to change. So as long as I cling to anything or attach to anything, as long as my mind is clinging here and my awareness is locked up in that, I'm going to have disappointment. I'm going to have pain. So the question isn't to run away from suffering, which is what most people think it is. Make the world a perfect place or make everything better. There shouldn't be all this suffering in the world. But the suffering is inherent in all form. And why is that it? Because it's the nature of duality. It's the nature of the dance of life and the play of life. So you fall down into separateness, and there's the dualities. There's rain and then there's sun. There's darkness and light. So the whole process is one of becoming free from suffering. But you can't do this by running away from your suffering, because then it's still got you and it's going to catch you and you're stuck in it. It's not about running away from suffering. As Uspensky said, there has to be suffering in order for spiritual growth. But at the same time, you must sacrifice being the one who suffers, which means sacrificing being that individual entity or that ego to which the suffering is happening, to which you're fully identifying with. But at the same time, suffering has to take place. It's part of form. That is what awakens you and what brings you back to God. So although at first we might not go searching for suffering, usually we avoid it. We want to avoid pain, and we want to stay as close as we can to happiness or peace or contentment. as we progress a little bit on our spiritual paths, we see that everything in this package that we have, every life circumstance that I come across, every feeling, not even every feeling and thought that I have is there for a reason. Everything that's ever happened to me, like we think if only this was different or if only that was different, but it's not. It's exactly the way it's supposed to be. Even those thoughts of if it was different or if it was different like this or if I had this, even that is a part of how it's supposed to be. So you can't escape from the reality of things. They say freedom from suffering only comes through enlightenment, the loss of the clinging of mind. So we come down, and we're not going to get into it too much here, but we come down into our separateness, into duality, into this material world, and there's suffering even on the other planes of existence too. So even if you go be like an astral plane, like a demigod or a deva or an angel or a saint or whatever, like Buddhism explains it really well, like the different lokas. So there's even beings that are in realms of existence where they meditate all day and live in complete bliss and ecstasy and stuff like that. Even in those planes of reality, there's still a little bit of clinging there. There's still suffering, even on planes of reality where beings live for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. They still take birth and death, and there's still forms of suffering because there's still the separateness. There's still the separate entity from the whole. There's still the God in the form of the one and the form of the many. So we come down here, we realize, first we try and run away from it. Then we realize suffering's inevitable. It's inherent in all form. So then we start to work with it. And that's why, like, if you look at great Christian mystics and saints, they would actually ask God, like St. John of the Cross or St. Thomas Aquinas, or St. Francis, they would ask God, they would pray for suffering to come into their lives because they knew that was the transformation that would bring them to God. Or like Hindus will call forth Kali, the Hindu goddess, to come with her sword and dagger and cut out those things which separate you from God. And the way that works is that it'll bring up all these issues in your life. It'll bring your attachments to the surface because you can go through and kind of numb your suffering. You can go through it and kind of numb it and try and live the least amount of suffering possible in your life and not really do that much and be kind of dull and go through it. But you're just going to keep going through lifetimes and lifetimes and staying asleep that way. So the suffering, rightly used, brings you to a point of awakening, a point of starting to awaken. So you could suffer a lot and it could be worthless from your perspective because you're just suffering. It's not really worthless, but you think it's worthless because you're like, man, this suffering stinks. And even when you're starting to wake up to it, the suffering still stinks. And you can see, you can't hide from it. If you want to be a healthy being and live, you have to live consciously with the joy and the suffering. So even though you're happy and joyous and free at some points in your life, you know there's other points where you weren't. And even in the best moments of my life, there's still other facets of myself, other parts of the universe that are suffering all the time. There's people suffering in the United States. There's people all over the world starving, full of disease. There's people in terrible family and life circumstances. People so caught in ego, so caught in delusion, so identified with their separateness, so caught in who they think they are and the way they think they should be. There's a lot of pain. And you have to be open to that too if you want to be a full human being. I can't push away either side. I can't push away either side. And we expect everyone to be here, that they should be good or they should know what they're doing, or it's not me, but it's these people are bad. If the world had more people like me, like I used to think if I was in charge of the world, things would be okay. But that's just not how it works, because if you think about it like this, with the different planes of reality and consciousness, just think of the kind of beings that take birth on the human plane. They're filled with greed, lust. We're filled with greed, lust, envy, deep attachment, resentment, hatred, anger, ill will. Buddha calls it the five hindrances. So we have a lot, we're asleep and we have a lot of suffering, and it's carried within our minds from lifetime to lifetime. So those impressions stay with the soul, or whatever you want to call it, but those impressions stay with the soul, and they move from lifetime to lifetime, from body to body, from whatever being you're at to whatever being you're at the next time. And you continue over the course of time to awaken more to who you are. And there's so many different methods that can be used. Like there's the four forms of yoga. There's bhakti yoga, the yoga of love and devotion towards. It starts off with towards specific deities like Krishna or Jesus or whoever you would choose it to be around. There's karma yoga, the yoga of action and selfless service, where you serve other beings, which ultimately, bhakti yoga ultimately ends up in the union of lover and beloved. Like if you read the poetry of Rumi or Kabir or Hafiz, karma yoga ends up in just being the act. There being no you, realizing, like it says in the Bhagavad Gita, all action takes place by the interweaving of the forces of nature, but man in his selfish delusion thinks himself the actor. And if you haven't read that book, it's a great holy book, Bhagavad Gita, you should. But in the Buddha says too, one who thinks himself still the doer can never be free from the rounds of birth and death. So, and what that means is that all the action taking place in the entire world is one happening. It's one nature, one whole that I'm a part of. So it's not the separate me, the separate ego that I think has the free will and is doing the action and the thinking, and the separate me that is choosing to do this or choosing to do that. That's how it's disguised, and that's how it seems. When in reality, it is all happening that my whole self is putting on. And I mean my whole self as the universe, not just my separate Alex here, who I think is doing things, but really is not. So, and we really cling to our separate entities. We really cling to our separate identification.